Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week at the Better Events Podcast. This is Mary Davidson, one of your co hosts. And in today's episode, we are doing another solo episode. And so you're going to hear from me today. And I just want to explain a little bit about it before we get into the episode. So, what I'm going to share is a recording from a live event that I spoke at about fundraising events. And so this was from the nonprofit events mini con. This was the first year that we did that, and I planned it with three other amazing co-hosts in the nonprofit event planning community. And this was my talk from that event. And this is all about what you should do at the beginning of your event planning process for a nonprofit event, especially an event like a fundraiser. And so you're going to kind of hear this. And I will say the quality of the recording is good. So you should be able to enjoy that. As we get to the end of the presentation, I start to talk a little bit more about permitting and things like that. So that may or may not be applicable to you based on where you live, but it will at least get your brain thinking a little bit about what you can do for the beginning of your nonprofit fundraising event as well. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Today we are talking about the starting line. And this looks like a lot of different things. And I know in the room we have different levels of experience. And so whether you are very experienced with nonprofit events or perhaps you're new to it, it's important to set some basics and some ground rules. And so that's what this session is going to be today. There's so many that we could talk about, but we're going to touch on these four. So goals, we kind of talked about that purpose. Budgets, that was mentioned. Timeline, and then permitting, the lovely conversation about permitting. So I'm going to challenge you today to pick one thing that you can do to improve in one of these areas throughout the session this morning. So whether you have a lot of experience or a little bit, there's always something that we can do to improve. So please try to pick one new thing. And if you have any questions today, we invite you to write them down. You have little note cards at the center of your table. We may not have time for questions in my session today, but you can write the questions down. We have a panel at the end of the day, and we can try to answer some of those if we don't get to them. So let's go ahead and jump right into it and talk about goals. So I don't know about you, but I have different reactions when I hear this word. Kind of like gives me some anxiety. I dread it a little bit. Maybe you feel similarly. Maybe you think this part of the event planning process is boring, or maybe it's essential. I don't know, but it evokes a lot of different emotions. And so let me just ask you hypothetically, why is goal setting important when you're planning an event? So just think about that. I think a lot of us know why. Should you set goals for every event, every time you do it, even if it's a repeat event that you've always done? So here are some things that might help answer that question for you. So the first thing that I like to do is determine if the event is a fundraiser or a friend-raiser. Maybe it's both. So an example of this, a gala or auction is primarily a fundraiser, right? Because our activities are really geared toward raising money. And community events might be more of a friend-raiser where you're raising awareness. So once again, it may be both, but part of this as we start off the planning process is to consider which one it is and why you're doing this event. Is it because you've always done it? That's kind of a bad reason, I think, to keep doing something just because you've always done it. So it is important to have strategy behind why you're doing it. So we have a quick story that I kind of want to paint this picture with. We worked with an organization, and they had put forth this program in the community that was really popular. And due to some reasons, they had to stop the program. And so it made the community, there was some people who were upset. And in this process, we were trying to plan an event, and it was going to be a fundraiser. And so the organization took a step back, and they were like, okay, we need to change gears. We're not going to ask for money right now. We're going to have a community event, and we're going to showcase the services that we are still providing to the community so we can show what else we're doing. And obviously there's more to it internally than that about the decisions that they made, but that's what they decided to do instead. So that's why this conversation is so important. Before they got too far down the line of planning, they had to pivot to a fundraiser. So these are definitely crucial conversations. The next thing would be to identify your why for the event, or your North Star. Something that I think is a fun exercise when you start off your process is to have everyone who's involved, like your key stakeholders, maybe that's some of your committee members, your staff for sure, or other individuals, come together in a meeting, and each of them individually share out what they think like success will be for the event, like what it looks like for them, or what they want to see from the event. When we do this exercise, something that I've found that's really interesting is there is a lot of alignment. Of course, sometimes there may not be, and there's no pre-prep to this. We're just having them show up. We're going to have this conversation. And through that conversation, we identify themes and the goals for the event. And so it's a really special exercise, I think, because it gives people kind of a space where they can individually be heard about the event. And like I said, including your staff in this, I think is really important. So that's a fun exercise that you might want to try if you don't do something like that. And then the next thing when determining your goals is to determine the audience. So who is this event intended for, and how do you craft the event for that experience? So for example, if your event is about students, do you have students attending the event? And if they're not, how are you representing them and their stories? Who needs to be represented in the program and or the audience? So these are just questions that you can think about at the beginning. You can ask yourself, your organization, and this helps, once again, determine your goals for the event. So the last thing in determining your goals is to determine the theme. So how are you going to weave in the theme into all the decisions that you make? And so I like to think of it, and I think some of us say this, like a red string that connects different parts of your event. And so the best is when that red string that goes from every component of your event also incorporates things back to your mission, right? That's an ideal situation. And so that all brings it together to tie into some of your overall goals. So that's goals, all right? We're going to move on to the next section, which is budgets. So this was mentioned before, so thank you for calling that out. I think, admittedly, at least if you're like me, our brain is going to hurt just a little bit in the next few minutes as we talk about this, but we can do it. So if you're comfortable admitting it, raise your hand if you have a budget for your event. It's a safe space. It's okay if you don't. Woo! All right, thank you for sharing. I know that it can be hard, but this is something that is super important to your planning process. So as you're determining your budget, this is a hot topic, determine are you including staff time? And I know that every nonprofit does this differently. So I'm not gonna say there's one way that's right or one way that's wrong, but it's something to consider, because this is the opportunity cost and the time that it takes your team to plan an event. So do you really know the return on investment and the time that it takes if you're not considering the value of your staff time? It's just, I feel like I'm like very heavily leaning on one side, and I'm like, it doesn't matter. But it is something to definitely consider, the opportunity cost. So one tip that I like to share is the cost to raise $1. So this is a fun calculation, super fun calculation that I like to use. And so, for example, you can divide your expenses by your gross revenue. So for example, if your event cost $2,500 and your revenue is $10,000, that's 25 cents to raise $1. And that's just simple math right there. But this is a good calculation that you can use when you're doing your budget. And so for example, if an event costs around 30 cents to raise $1, I would say, in my opinion, that's a pretty great event ROI. But then when it starts getting more into like that 60 cents to raise $1, which is more common in friend raising, that is something to acknowledge. And so it's just a helpful number to look at. Another thing that's helpful when doing your budget is past data. So if you have access to that, make sure that you can get it and start making some decisions about your budget, looking at what happened previous years. And then also sponsorship, which is a huge conversation. But it's amazing to see some organizations that cover all their expenses before the event even begins through sponsorship. But I totally acknowledge that that's something that's really hard to accomplish. But so if that's not your case, what do you have as a sponsorship goal that is significant enough to cover your expenses? Or where is that revenue coming from? Is it your ticket sales or other revenue generating activities? And that's something you're considering as you're making your budget. In-kind sponsorship, by the way, can really help with this as well, right? So as you're considering that, this is like very high-level budget stuff, But other things to consider that I thought might be helpful are increasing costs. So we know that costs are increasing, but specifically in 2025, we've heard a lot about catering costs that are increasing, and that's just the name of the game, not like calling out the caterers or anything like that. But we're dealing with this recently with a client budget that they made last year, but their catering costs went up 25%, and so that really messed with their budget. And so just kind of getting ahead of that and understanding what those costs are looking like for this year or for your next event. The last thing is hidden costs. And so these are things that come up that you may not be planning on, or maybe you already do know, but things like permits, service charges, gratuities, credit card processing fees. Once you know about these, you can plan for them in your budget, but those are some things that kind of pop up unexpectedly. So as you can tell, we have a short amount of time today, so all of this is we're only getting so deep, but we're gonna move on to timelines. So this is something I'm actually really excited to talk about, and this is probably because I like logistics, but some call this a planning timeline, a work back schedule, an event production schedule, a work plan. There's so many names for this, but it's basically a big list that includes the tasks that need to happen before your event. And ideally, it includes dates and responsible parties. So what I've seen work best is when this is a collaborative document or space or something like that. So we kind of use like a shared doc, but whether you have a project management system or something like that, the key that I've found to be successful with timelines is that other people can track and make edits and take ownership of the tasks that they're responsible for. So super essential when you're working with a team, and so when they can all work on the same document together, it seems to work well. And so you start with the event and then you work backwards. And so through this, you're going to identify your key milestones, and that looks like a lot of different things. So you can, these are just some of them, right? Booking the venue, sending out the save the date, sponsorship deadlines, ticket sales, or when the registration launches and closes, permitting due dates, when the final catering numbers are due, super important date, print dates for time-sensitive items like signage or program catalogs, and then just other contractual due dates like when materials are due to the AV team and things like that. So I'm going to give you an example. This is one of the timelines that we use. If you need one, you can actually email me. I have my email in the corner. And this is something that we do in like a spreadsheet, obviously, but there's some things I want to call out with the key components, and you may do this in a different way. So as you can see under tasks, it calls out some of those important things. By the way, this is like the first tiny bit of an event. This document is way longer than this. But you have your kickoff meeting, confirming the venue, determining the theme, sending out the save the date, getting the logo for this year, stuff like that. And then you have the category next to it where you're putting into categories. This is really helpful, I think, for teams that have departments or people who are just doing marketing and stuff like that. So you can categorize it by that. And then the lead is, I think I alluded to this earlier, I think the most important column. So who is taking ownership of that specific task? And this is very vague, but you can write, specific individuals' names there. And then the status column is fun. If you like Excel, this is done with data validation, which I love. And you can make it color-coded, and you can just mark when it's completed, in progress, past due, all of those things. Of course, the due date and notes. So if you don't have a timeline, perhaps this will be helpful for you, but this is just a good example. So we're going to move on from timeline and jump into the last favorite section of the day, I'm sure, permitting. So permitting is overwhelming, and I totally understand that. If there's anyone here that loves to apply for permits, please come talk to me. I'd love to just learn more about you. Many nonprofits I interact with find certain components of permitting and licensing confusing, and that's because it is. And so we're going to share some tips and tricks with you today. This alone could be its own session, and so what I'm going to do instead is focus on a few resources that you can refer to help answer your questions as you're planning your event. And so I'm going to have some QR codes and other things, so have your phones handy. If you feel like you might need some support, you can grab the links from there. So we're first going to cover the typical types of permits and licenses that you might have for your event. And so here are some. You have your special occasion license, which, by the way, I'm going to explain these very high level. But the special occasion license is something, actually, let's see. Have you all applied for a special occasion license before? Yes? most of you, it's very common. It gives nonprofits the opportunity to sell alcohol at their event. And then there's the raffle license. This one I think is the most controversial license out there, in my opinion. So high level, but if you raffle more than $5,000 a year, that's when you may need a raffle license. There's also other circumstances in which you need a raffle license, but that's one of them. You then have your banquet permit. This is more for a private event with alcohol service. There's the temporary food establishment permit. That's through the health department. We've used that when you, for example, have an event that maybe is like a little unconventional. You have stuff outdoors or something. This is just an example. And you have caterers or vendors who have like a booth and they're giving food away. That's when you're going to need that food establishment permit. If you use food trucks, generally they have one already, so that's something important to ask. Fire permits, that is its own thing, so I'm going to refer to the local city or county fire department in which you're holding your event, but typically it has to do with how many people you have at your event, where the exits are, and what kind of tenting you're using, stuff like that. And then the city special event permit. This is different for a lot of cities. We did an event in a really small city next to Tacoma, and their permitting rules were way stricter than we had experienced with other cities. And so be sure you're just looking ahead of time at what that might be. And then reseller permits, which are bigger. That's for nonprofits generally throughout the year, but it gives you wholesale pricing, which you can use when you're getting things for events. And then just a couple other things you may run into. There's large banner permits. And so if you're hanging a banner somewhere really large somewhere, or you're trying to hang a banner like over a street, there's Vision Zero policies and things like that, and so you may need a permit for your large banner. And then also we like to call out here just your insurance, like a certificate of insurance that you're likely going to need to provide to your venue or some other vendor as well. So here are the resources that I was referring to. So I'm going to try to talk slow so you can have time to get the QR codes if you'd like. So the first one is the Fundraising Event Toolkit. This is probably the most helpful resource that you can use. It's created by multiple associations and departments. They came together to compile this toolkit. It covers liquor, cannabis, and gambling, but also covers raffles and things like that, which is part of the gambling. And so with this, I would say this is something that I still refer to all the time. If you're confused about your raffle, there is a section in there that is super helpful, and I would challenge you, if you haven't looked up the raffle laws, I'm not trying to like go so hard on the raffle, but if you spend 5 minutes to go look at what it lists there, it might be very enlightening to you, so I would just encourage you to check that out. The next one is the special occasion license, which we've already talked about, but this is a direct link to more specific information about it. It's also mentioned in the fundraising event toolkit, but that just gets you to a more specific location. And then the raffle FAQ QR code is also, once again, additional helpful information. So I'll try to leave that slide up for just a couple, like 1 more minute. But most applications need to be applied for 45 to 60 days in advance. It just depends on the permit. And it also depends on how busy the departments are, like the Liquor Control Board or the Gambling Commission. And so that's something to consider, is try to just get it in as soon as you can. I will say if you're in a pinch, we've been able to work with them on some pretty quick turnarounds, so don't be afraid to pick up the phone and let them know that you need it soon. They also have a ton of resources online, and they're accessible by phone and email. I've reached out to them about a lot of questions, and that might concern like some of you. Like usually I'm not telling them everything about the event. I'm just like vaguely asking a question, and they are super helpful and like very willing to support. And so to help you out there, here are their phone numbers. You can give them a call. I am not like, I feel like I'm advertising for them almost, but this is just to help you out. And so you can find these on Google, but I put them here just for ease if you'd like to ever get some questions answered directly. So that does bring me to the end of my session today. I know we've covered a lot of things. I just want to encourage you once again to try one thing to power up your next event. and ideally one thing that you can do at the beginning of your planning process from something that you've learned today. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody, that is a wrap. So thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Better Events podcast. I really appreciate your time today and hope that you learned something new. You can follow us on all social media platforms, pretty much at Better Events Pod. You can send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me and Logan directly on LinkedIn. We love to hear from you. But with that, we will see you again next Wednesday.